right now.
Great. Well, awesome. Hey, welcome everyone. This is Crisis Management for your meetings and events. And I hope the video is coming in. I'm Joanna Pineda. I'm CEO and Chief Troublemaker here at Matrix Group International. And I'm here with Bob Mellinger. Bob, say hi.
Hi.
So, you know, we decided to do this webinar because I was, having a conversation with Bob I've known for many years, and we're kind of approaching this whole concept of what do you need to do about your conference completely differently, right? So Bob's going to talk to you about his business, and I'll talk to you about mine. And hopefully kind of at the end of this, you'll have a lot more kind of useful information about how do you even approach this crisis, and how do you plan for the next one? How do you survive this? So a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this, and we're going to send you a copy of the slides as well as a link to the recording within the next day or two. So please feel free to share widely. We want everyone to have this information. You are automatically muted. We're all working from home. I'm obviously in the nice conference room today for this webinar, but for the most part, we're all working from home. We got dogs barking. We had kids screaming in the background. So we're muting you. If you've got a question, go back into the Zoom tab. And if you are on YouTube, then send us a message on Facebook Messenger. So go to the Matrix Group Facebook page. It's facebook.com/Matrix Group. Send us a message. I've got someone monitoring that, and they'll get the question to us. If you have questions after today's webinar, Bob and I are so happy to chat with you about this. Bob in particular, he's the expert, and he said, look, this is just a really kind of trying and exhausting and emotional time for so many of us. Bob and I are going to make ourselves available. So many of you know Matrix Group, but for those of you that don't, we're a digital agency. We're based here in Crystal City. We work almost exclusively with associations and nonprofits. And really what we do is we help them increase membership and raise revenue, right? So we help them increase revenue or stem decline. We help them with their member retention through web, mobile, and social. We help them reach new audiences with a clear brand. And for many clients as well, they come to us because they say, we've got a lot of systems that we got to tie together to just make it a better experience for our staff and for our members. Here are our services. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but whether it's you need a new strategy, you're thinking about what you want to do virtually for your next conference, if you're thinking you want to do a whole trade show and conference online, if you're thinking about doing a website redesign, if you're thinking about how to tie all these systems together, please give us a shout. So Bob, tell us about Attainium and why I invite you. You're the subject matter expert here today.
So you tell me, and I'm going to try and live up to that expectation. Attainium are in the business continuity planning and event crisis planning business. Our job is to make sure that you're ready before this stuff hits. So if I don't know you, you might be a little late on COVID-19 as it relates to me, but we're here to ensure
hang on, Bob.
the resilience.
Bob, hang on.
Yes.
You've got some warbling. Leah, you're in Philly. Are you getting warbling on your end from Bob as well?
No, I'm hearing fine on my end.
Oh, okay. So you're hearing fine. Great. Then Bob, all yours. My apologies.
Okay. Well, maybe I'm just doing that with my voice naturally. I have a natural warble to my voice, but yeah, we work in the area of business continuity planning, which deals with crisis management, emergency response, disaster recovery, and that's how to keep your organization ready and responding. In case of events, we actually have a targeted service just for event crisis planning, so for that on-site group. I'll tell you what, guys, let me do this. Since apparently I am warbly, I'm seeing it across the bottom. Let me call in on my cell phone real fast. So
okay.
if that's all right, so I'm going to hang up, and and Joanna, you can sing like I know you used
Absolutely.
to.
I'll sing and dance and, keep talking. All right. Thank you,
All right,
Bob.
I'll be back.
Okay. What's that?
I'm going to go ahead and pause for just a second.
No, let's go ahead and keep going.
You got it.
Okay. Are we back on? All right. Okay, so you know what? While we're waiting for Bob and Leah, and I think we've got some other folks like Dave, Leah, Maria. Are we coming in okay?
I'm hearing great on my end.
Okay, all right. For any of the other folks who are on this webinar, if you are having issues, if you could let us know, and then we can figure out kind of where that issue might be. All right, but let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, the reason why we decided to do this webinar is, I had a conversation with Bob, and he said, "Wow, how's it going?" And I said, "Well, I've got a bunch of clients that are canceling meetings and trying to figure out what are we going to do? Are we going to cancel? Are we going to postpone? Are we going to decide to go online?" And he said, "Well, I'm approaching it from a completely different perspective, which is, what's the planning that needs to happen before the conference, and how do you really kind of respond to this and remediate afterwards?" So, Bob, how are you doing? Are you back with us? Okay, hang on, we're waiting for Bob. I've been reading about how even Zoom, you probably see if you're an admin, when you log into Zoom, you'll see that it'll say things like, "We're so sorry, you might experience some, loss of fidelity on the video just because, I guess there's just so many people on Zoom these days." Even my 9-year-old is doing, Zoom conference calls. Brian, what's going on here?
We're still waiting for Bob to call in. Hopefully he'll call in through the number that's provided in the webinar.
Okay, all right. Hopefully Bob is dialing in. All right, well, you know what? I'm going to keep going. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to be talking about the 5 phases of crisis management. And then we're going to talk about where are we now, right? So we're in this COVID-19 crisis. Where are we in the 5 phases? Because I think it's really helpful for kind of thinking about the framework, right? And thinking about how do we respond to this. The next thing we're going to talk about is how do you prepare for the next crisis? I mean, I think that there's an awful lot of lessons to be learned from this crisis. And then finally, we're going to be talking about what's the framework for making decisions specifically about your upcoming meetings. It's kind of a given at this point, given all of the, kind of stay-at-home orders from the governors, that for the March, April, and May meetings, those meetings are canceled or going online or, getting postponed. But what about the June meetings? What about the July and August meetings? And finally, hopefully, we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So we know that COVID-19 is the crisis du jour, right? Like this is the crisis that we're focused on right now. But it's definitely the case that as organizations, any type of organization, you've got all kinds of crises that require planning and response. Here at Matrix Group, we have to go through yearly audits for our different systems, and one of the questions is, what's your disaster recovery plan? So several years ago, I convened a disaster recovery group, and we meet once a month, and basically what we've been doing every month is taking different scenarios that we might find ourselves in, and then saying, what do we need to do to respond? And the good news for us is when this COVID-19 thing came about, I asked the person who's in charge of that committee, I said, "Hey, is this covered in our DR planning?" And she said, "Well, not exactly a pandemic like this, but we definitely have this." So we were able to activate the plan. We did find that we had holes in the plan, but at least we had something that we could, kind of use as a starting point, and it really facilitated all the things that have allowed us to, kind of keep the lights on and make sure that, we don't skip a beat for our clients. So do we have Bob back on?
I see the little microphone icon, Bob. Want to say hey?
Bob, you want to say hello?
I believe
Okay.
I'm here now.
Yay, terrific. Leah, how does Bob sound?
How am I doing now, guys?
I think you sound great on our end.
You sound great on my end.
Okay,
Well,
awesome.
good.
All right.
And high fives from everybody,
long
Bob. Great.
Okay, awesome. Hey, thanks for that. So, right, well, you know what? I just kept talking. So we're going to talk about the 5 phases of crisis management, and this is really the Bob Mellinger show. So, Bob, here are the 5 phases. I'm going to summarize them, and then you're going to provide all the details. So there's awareness, which is really kind of figuring out what do you need to know. There's preparation, there's mitigation, there's response and recovery. So you're going to go through these 5 phases, and then we're going to say, and you and I are going to share lots of stories, and then we're going to talk about where are we today with COVID-19. So let's go ahead and get started. So, we were talking about this, and you said, hey, here are the 5 phases. And you said, but before any of these phases even happen, you've got to have staffing in place. So we decided that that was like 0. Talk to us about staffing. Why is this so important?
Okay, first of all, we can go back to some basic project management. It's great to come up with a plan, but if nobody owns the pieces of it, it's never going to get done, or it's going to be totally reactionary. So the first thing you've got to do when it comes to any kind of crisis planning is assign people the responsibility of owning the stuff we're going to talk about over the next, 40 or so minutes. So be aware of that. And again, different people might show up in different places. So different threats, different hazards might have different person in charge. For example, the person in charge of a cyber attack or a cyber incident is probably different than the hurricane, or is probably different than the person that may be running your COVID-19 response at this time. So you want to put the person, kind of in the incident command seat that has the best information on what they're going to need to be dealing with. So again, having the wrong person in the leadership spot could be dangerous. On the other hand, this is something you can figure out ahead of time. But make sure people are assigned and that they own that responsibility.
So Bob, I have a question for you. So here at Matrix Group, there's a woman she's kind of like a manager of special projects, and she's in charge of the DR response for us. Does it mean that she's going to be in charge of the COVID-19 response? She's the one who's kind of in charge of the plan, if that makes sense. She makes sure that, when I say, hey, I think we need to activate the plan for, the whole building, being closed. So who's that kind of a person, and what kind of skills do they need?
Yeah, in many cases, there is someone who sort of has the knowledge of the plan. So that's the resource to the person that we might have listed on this slide. When it comes to making the decision to do something, that's different than the understanding of the plan. So for example, in your example of do you close the building and how does that work, the plan may come to you and say, here are the things that we thought about ahead of time. On the other hand, it sounds like you get that decision versus her, whether to close it or not. So the decisions are not necessarily the same owner as the plan itself. Now, the fact that you have somebody owning the plan makes me very, very happy, because that means that plan is likely to stay current and at least get looked at, hopefully before the fact.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. That's terrific. Okay, so step number 1 is really, there's 2 aspects to this. You say it's monitoring, right? So talk to us about it.
Okay, monitoring. The first thing you're trying to figure out in the monitoring part of any crisis is what's going on. And in any case, it steps back. And I love the way this first bullet says. It says what's in play. At any given point in time, as you sort of circle the year, different hazards or threats may be in play. Right now, we're in the middle of COVID-19. In about another, month and a half, 2 months, around the 1st of June, we'll be in hurricane season. Flu season starts again next fall, in the October 1st-ish time frame, as examples. So those are things that have sort of scheduled seasons to them. But knowing what's in play as it relates to to a meeting, when you're going to somewhere, where are you going? What are the types of threats and hazards that might be in play in that location? What's happening now? So what are people, what are they actually dealing with? I mean, now we're dealing with COVID-19 everywhere, but if you had a meeting in say Miami in July, I'd say hurricanes should be on your list. Earthquakes in California, though they're not overly frequent, they are devastating. So are you going to be in California? What about the fires of recent years, the floods? So, kind of what's happening there. Knowing who to go to for valid info. I was quoted in an ASAE article about the coronavirus, and I said, don't get caught up in the hype. I'm going to clarify that right now. I meant get yourself some good information from valid, reliable sources, not just from, if you get your news from Facebook, maybe we need to have an offline chat. But for this particular case, how about the World Health Organization, the CDC, state and local health departments, state governments are in play now where they weren't before. Same thing holds true with any threat that you're looking at based on either where you're going to hold a meeting or where your offices are. So where do you get it? And then you're looking for triggers in this case. So the person assigned to monitoring, you're in hurricane season, things may be going great, but at some point you may see that there's a hurricane watch coming. So within the next week or two, there might be a hurricane going to hit this proverbial meeting in Miami. That could trigger a response that you may now need to be looking at things a little more seriously. In the case of the pandemic here, watching the rate at which there were infections, or I should say contractions and deaths, looking at that. As that number, as you can tell now, it's sort of geometrically going at this point. But in the beginning, it wasn't that dramatic. But where is it? What's going on? And that's kind of what I mean by where do you trigger? What do you use to trigger a response? And that's monitoring. That goes on and on. That'll go on until the situation is over. You want me to keep going?
Yeah, but it sounds like, if you're a meeting planner, and I know we have a lot of meeting planners here, it could be, really pretty important to just say for every meeting that we're doing, we got to figure out what's at play, where are we going to get information, and who's going to be in charge of just making sure that we're even receiving the information, because you don't want to get caught flat-footed. So I got it.
That's correct. Absolutely perfect.
The other aspect of awareness you say is assessing. So it's monitoring and assessing, right? So talk to us about assessing.
Okay, now assessing is, you may have heard the term impact analysis, which is a very academic way of just trying to figure out what the given situation, I'm going to call it a crisis, that's in play from the monitoring part up above. What would happen to you if that crisis actually occurred? So what would it do to operations? What would it do to future meetings, say looking out weeks or months? How's it going to handle economics? What's it going to do to your reputation? So part of the assessment is looking at what that crisis, whether it be a hurricane, coronavirus, you name it, is going to do to your organization and or your meeting. Now from there, that assessment should give you some ideas of some things you should do also, which is to look at contracts, staffing, insurance, governance. There's been some interesting stories coming up of groups that are unable, boards, for example, that are unable to vote because they have to be in the same place, physically co-located in order to vote. It's not everywhere, but that would be a real surprise if you found that out now versus 2 months ago. So while you're assessing and doing impact is look at the things that might not work as they do now based on what the impact of that particular crisis is. And in this case, that's assessing. By the way, that is also a moving target. So Joanna mentioned earlier, you probably have your March, April, and maybe May meetings canceled. So you might be looking at June, July, and August. At what point do you make that decision? Part of that is the assessment. As you're assessing what the impact of this is going to be, when does it become the least economically disastrous to cancel the meeting? There might be a point. Do you have the triggers from monitoring that say, yeah, this is going to we have to make that decision in 3 weeks or it becomes twice as costly. So in that assessment, you want to be looking at all those components to try and figure out how you can have the least impact on you.
Bob, I would say one of the things that we do in our organization, and we don't obviously hold meetings, but is we keep track of when we need to give notice on things, because I never want anything to automatically roll over, and I never want to have like the deadline for canceling to kind of pass without me knowing. So it might be in some cases, again, in terms of assessing, just making sure that you're aware of all the dates. Dates mean a lot. So like in this case, like Bob said, if you're in a situation where you've got meetings, know and have it in a handy place. What are all the dates? When is the cutoff for canceling the buses? When is the cutoff for canceling the catering? What's the, when's the cutoff for anything? So just knowing all that stuff without having to do it at the last minute. I'll tell you a story. This is actually somebody that I know. When all of this really started to hit, she, CEO of an organization, and she said, Joanna, I just had to cancel my meeting. It's in 3 weeks. I haven't even talked to the hotel yet but she said, I was getting so much pressure from my board and from my membership to cancel, but I just did it. I don't even know what it's going to do to me. So I think, Bob, you would say, you know, if you had all the information ahead of time, you're less likely to make a decision like that. That feels really uncomfortable and kind of scary, right?
Absolutely. It's not easy to do that, but the more that you assess, the more that you look at the impact, and again, regardless of whether it's a meeting or an event or whether it's your own organization, being able to look at that and figuring out what the impact is and when. So a lot of the groups we're working with now are looking at a 4 to 6 week window, and it moves. So every week they reassess and they add on a week at the end to kind of see how that's going to, you know, what their impact's going to be so they can monitor and make good decisions.
So Bob, step number 2 is preparation. This is the really hard part, right?
It's the part most people forget.
Yeah, okay, there you go. I think that's a better way of describing it.
So preparation is basically what you need to do to get ready for something. It's not what you do to get ready for something once it's happened. It's what you do to get ready before it's happened, thus the term preparation. So some are is up here on the slide. Some are planning for the flu season, starting to get your wipes and your hand sanitizer, working at, if you're one of those organizations that gives your staff flu shots for nothing. You have to prep for that. So, you know, the fall planning for snowstorms. For those of you that are in the snow region, I don't see snow except in the mountains, but I do remember from my many years of living in Virginia. But, you know, you need to be ready for that. Something as simple as, how are you going to tell people they shouldn't come to work tomorrow? It could be as simple as that communication, which is further down in terms of protocols. So planning is what are those things you can do in advance? What needs to be in place? Who's in charge? And that kind of goes back to some of that, to what is it, number 0 that we had earlier, which is assigning responsibilities and also assigning the authority. So who is in charge? Who's in charge if the person that's in charge isn't available for whatever reason? So chain of command falls into that. So what's your command structure in that case? Communication protocols are simple as, how do you let staff know not to come to the office tomorrow because we're getting snowed out? Now in DC, you may have said, well, if the government's closed, we're closed. That's a good protocol. You may not even have to not have to actually issue a communique. In the case of COVID, I'm going to bet you've sent out more communications and received more communications about this event than you have about anything, pretty much anything ever. I know I've saved virtually every COVID-19 message I've gotten, and I think I'm going to have to store them offline. They've gotten to be so many. So who can make these decisions is real important as well. And then the last one, I think, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, please.
No, I was just being sorry. So, you know, as we were doing our planning, this is, I don't know, maybe about a year ago, and we were looking at different ways to kind of have communications with the staff. And I said, look, if something happens and we need to tell staff right away, you know, you can't get into the building, how are we going to do it? So this is just as an FYI. I said, hey guys, what do you think about WhatsApp? And I got pushback from the staff. Some of them were like, oh, it's another app. I don't want another app on my phone. And I said, oh, God, okay. And we said, well, should we send an email when not everyone checks their email during off hours? And I said, okay, well, what are we going to do? And so I think we settled on an emergency text sent out via Slack. I can't remember. We sent out, you know, tests. And it turns out that we were able to use it when I made the decision, 3.5 weeks ago to, you know, people should stay home. But we actually had a situation a few months ago where there was a bomb threat in Crystal City. And basically Arlington said, you know, like, and it was like a couple buildings away from us. So our street was closed. So we were able to use it. But the reason why we even developed this system, Bob, in the first place was because many, many years ago, we had, I can't remember, it was a snowstorm. And we found, and something happened to the internet or something. And so like we couldn't get access to the online staff directory. So that's when we went to, well, I guess there are certain of us who have to have like all the numbers in our phone, and we also have paper copies. It's crazy, but you know, we tried to think about all the things that we need to do to be able to contact staff.
Sure. There's also a number of services that fall under the category of mass notification systems. Right. One Call Now is a good example, and they're not that expensive. You know, I mean, if you have tens of thousands of people, that's one thing. But if you have a staff of 20 or 30, it might only be a few $100 a year to be able to send texts and messages and things. So worth looking into. Mass notification systems or mass notification services it's the kind you get if you have kids in school and you register for that thing and the school tells you way more than you wanted to know. It's those services. And they have them available that you can do text and leave phone messages. They're excellent. They're way better than phone trees, way better, and way better than email by itself.
Right. So Bob, I think that the last point here is like, under what circumstances do you move into response mode? Right. So like when you make the decision, when do you decide that you're going to cancel the meeting and now you're in response mode? And I think you're saying every organization has to decide that for themselves. You need to figure out what the triggers are.
That's correct. And some of that is based on your assessment. Some of that may be we will evaluate the following criteria. And while we're doing that is thinking through that decision-making process. I've talked to numerous groups. Some say, well, you call it preparation. Others say, well, we'll call that awareness. It's still supposed to happen before the fact. But there needs to be something that says this is more than just a potential problem. We're getting in the middle of it. So that's, I think that's pretty crucial. And again, it just gives you that framework, that protocol to be able to do it.
So then we get to step 3, which is mitigation. And this is what you can do ahead of time to really reduce the effects or eliminate or the impact of the disruption, right? So
That's
like right
correct.
now, for example, when this stuff just started to really hit, I know for me, what happened was there wasn't any stay-home orders yet in the DC region, but I remember for me, there was an article in the Atlantic that really made an impact on me. So I called my leadership team and we made the decision before other organizations had done it. And I basically said, you know what, there's no reason for us not to work from home because we're set up for it. So we made the decision. So in our case, that's the mitigation for us. We send people home early to work from home to hopefully prevent people from getting sick. And then I said, just because you're home doesn't mean that you should be congregating and having a good old time. Socializing, please don't do that.
Yeah, the key is, and I think, so leveraging the point you just said is one of the mitigation strategies that you actually employed was you figured out that you could work from home and that it would lessen the impact. So for example, we've been running tabletop exercises for pandemics for years now. Most of the time people would go, boy, that'll never happen. Well, I hate being right, but I think we were in this case. But the thing that came up was the mitigation strategy was typically work from home until the IT people came along and said, you realize we don't have the capacity to do this, and half the people don't even know how. So what ended up coming out of that was a time to do some testing and training ahead of the fact, which those that did that weren't scrambling at the end. So can we have everybody work from home, for example? I mean, it sounds like a good strategy, but until you do it, you don't know if it works. And I'm just talking technically. I'm not talking, socially or from a human capacity. I'm just talking can you technically and physically do it? So one of the mitigation strategies is to do that, that will lessen it. From the flu, wipes and things like that. From the standpoint of hurricanes, if you want to look that way. Knowing some of the terms can help you be better able to act on things. Do you know what the difference is between a watch and a warning? Very simple. So you're looking for those things you can do. Now remember, you can't always mitigate because you don't have control. When Joanna and I were talking the other day, we were talking about hurricanes a little bit. And if you're on site at a venue or getting ready to go on site, you can't mitigate what that venue does. I mean, you can learn, you can get as much as you can, but you can't make their building stronger. You can't make them have more food to help you shelter in place if you need to. You can ask, but you don't control that part. So look at what you can mitigate and do. For example, people that do CPR classes, and first aid training, that's a mitigation strategy. So if someone gets hurt or injured, you have the ability to act upon that by reducing the impact of that particular threat. How many of you use firewalls for your cyber in your IT strategy? Joanna and I probably remember the time where firewalls were optional, which is really scary because I'm sure any cyber person would lose their job for picking the wrong side of that multiple choice question. So a firewall is a mitigation strategy to keep you from getting hacked. Does it work all the time? No. But does it mitigate it? Way more than if you didn't have it. Making sure people understand the situation at hand. I've been in a lot of places where you say, do you do fire drills? And they go, well, sort of. Do people know where to go? Not really. Well, you want to mitigate people getting injured during an evacuation. Having them know where to go is kind of important. And that comes to the last one. Run tests, exercises, train, fire drills. Doesn't matter. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And knowing, I've talked to enough people in New York, say New York, in tall high rises. Most people have never been in those stairwells. So how do you know when it goes down 10 floors and then cuts to the right and goes to the other side of the building and drops down another 15 floors? And then it does something else. You know, there's different situations for which that understanding could come in handy. So test, train, look at those things that if you had them procedurally or a box full of them in place, you could mitigate whatever that given circumstance is or that crisis is.
You know, Bob, there was a story after 9/11 about the crisis manager from one of the big firms. I think it was Morgan Stanley, but I can't remember. But it was the crisis manager, and he insisted on drills. And apparently the partners hated him because it was a waste of time. It was taking them away from their clients' work. But nobody died because they knew what to do.
You bet.
So that was,
and it sounds dumb. It really does. A lot of the clients that I worked with and actually took their pandemic drills seriously did really well, are doing really well through this. It's not fun. You know, they're not like suddenly magically knowing something you don't. But boy, when it came time to work from home, they were ready. And that's real important. And they were looking out and they were evaluating. They were doing a lot of what we're talking about from these steps or these phases.
Yeah, I know I've got one client that, you know, a lot of staff didn't even have the capability of working from home because they didn't have laptops. So they were working hard to get laptops. And guess what? There was a run on laptops. So there was a delay in getting laptops to folks. So, all right.
And that's only part of it, as we know. So,
yes, only part of it. Yeah. I mean, like, you know, you got to make sure if people need to log into the VPN, they need the software, they need the this, the that, the two-factor software. So anyway. All right, so number 4 is the response. This is when you're actually executing the plan in response to the crisis. So we're in the crisis now. We're in this pandemic situation. We're in response mode. So, you know, what's this about?
Yeah, this is the part that all of those other, well, 3 plus 0 went to set up for. So now you're actually having to deal with whatever it is. And part of that comes down to is how do you do it? You know, working from home might be one of the things. You know, how would you work without your building if your building was still standing? You know, like we've had situations where there have been homicides in the building and the police lock it down. Well, everything's running, nobody can get in. So you think about the different types of things. Now you have to look at the actual impacts on business, not just the assessed impacts on business. So what is going to happen next week, the week after, and the week following? Is there a meeting coming up that needs to be canceled, whether it be your annual conference or a board meeting or a committee meeting? So now you have to start looking at these. Now, in the case of the current COVID-19 situation, the people that got slammed real hard were the ones that didn't have a lot of notice. So all of a sudden it's the 1st of March, the world's coming, you know, falling apart, and they've got a meeting in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Okay, the ones that had them in August still have some time. So as you could see, things were, you know, kind of falling off of calendars real quickly. How do you make that decision? How do you decide when? A lot of that was the previous steps. Are you having meetings? Are you getting the team together, that crisis team together, to be able to assess this stuff and make the decisions? All that assessment's still going on, by the way. All the monitoring and the assessing from the awareness phase is still going on, and that's the data that feeds the response. Now you're going to find out who actually got the message, who was trained, who wasn't, you know, who was listening when that work at home order came out and was told to take their laptop home and didn't. Are there people that, you know, their home lives are now getting goofed up? You know, now you have, you know, schools are canceled, so now kids are at home. All right, aside from noise in the back of a conference call, they're also changing the way your day goes. So is it a normal, 9 to 5 kind of thing, or do people get flexibility in work hours just because their home life is now different? It depends. What are the legal ramifications of the fact that you're in the middle of this and you need to respond to situations as they come up? What's the frequency of communications with staff, members, constituents, leadership, governance, all that? How does that work? Is the technology working? So as you're going through this response, it sounded good. Does everybody get it? The problems are going to be different. And then there's the whole human component. Some people like to work from home. Others, it doesn't work well for them. Being alone in a room is not what, they'll say they didn't sign up for. So how all that plays in, and it's a moving target. So again, each week you need to keep looking out, taking that assessment data in and being able to actually make operational decisions. And that's what response is all about. Some of it's short and sweet. You have a fire alarm go off in the building and everybody runs out. Well, maybe it wasn't your floor, it was some smoke or whatever, but people know what to do. They respond to it. That event could end fairly quickly. This one's not going to end, when the fire alarm goes off. This one's going to go on for a little while. And then depending on, where you get your data, some people are thinking it's going to happen every year, not to this magnitude, but we're going to run into a new one every year. Who knows? I'm not saying it either way. I just think one needs to be aware of this. And as you're responding, make sure you're focused on what your data tells you and what decisions you need to make in order to keep moving. The other thing about response to a situation like COVID-19 or any pandemic is you need to start looking at the types of business functions that you can turn off. You're going to be running on, your staff may be running on a limited capacity. So now, are there things you don't need to do that you can reassign or redirect people to be able to provide? You need more people taking member calls, but there's some other things that we're not going to do that we could redirect people. So unlike, say, a hurricane where you're trying to figure out what the most important things are to get back up and running, you can look at this the other way and say, what are some things that we can stop doing and have that, human resources for other places?
Bob, I would say what I'm seeing with clients is the clients with a plan are able to say, here's the plan, and here are the elements of the plan that people are working on. Janie's doing this, and Bob's doing this, and Joanna's doing this, and Brian's doing this. And what I've found is it's allowed the other parts of the organization to say, great, there's a plan, I'm calm. They're taking care of that stuff, so I can do my thing. So we've seen some clients say, you know what, it sucks that the meeting got canceled, but there's this other side of the business, the association, that's really, really important. And if they get sucked into this, it's really going to hurt us. We're really going to spiral. Right. So having kind of the plan in place so that people know what they're supposed to do to respond, but then for the other folks, they don't have a role, don't let them spin.
Yeah, I think the key is think of it as the lines on a road. It kind of keeps you going in the right direction, keeps you from running into the wrong lane, but it doesn't necessarily keep you from driving onto the berm if you have to suddenly for some reason. So it's guidance. It should not necessarily be taken literally, like we do step 1 through 2, 3, 4, and now we're at 5. We can't do 5, so we stop and wait. All right? It needs to have some fluidity. Treat it like guidance. It needs to be a way of not. Here's the way I like to look at it: is the plan should be all the things you don't want to forget. It's easy when you have smart people dealing with the stuff they know, but what about the things that they just don't remember? How do you make sure that those get folded in? And that helps make the response part so much more easy to deal with, giving you those guidelines and that insight. So yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Those with a plan now are probably a lot less stressed than those that didn't have any sort of guidance or guidelines at all. Right.
Brian, we have a question.
Yeah, and I know we've gotten into this much further on some other webinar projects that we've conducted, but somebody's curious about what kind of technology can be helpful in these situations.
For like work from home?
I think work from home, communication, alerting, etc. I suspect that's a case where we could go on and on and on about all the technologies, but I didn't know if
So just really quickly, because we've got some other stuff. So I'll tell you, we maybe in the follow-up, we'll share with you some of the tools that we're using, but certainly what we are using here at Matrix Group is we've got G Suite. So we're using that for email and docs and calendar and all that stuff, but we're also using Slack for kind of the kind of instant communications between staff. We're using Zoom a lot for the meetings and really turning on that video. And then we certainly, for clients that are on Office 365, we know that they're really doubling down on Teams, both for the collaboration as well as the, kind of face-to-face. And Bob, just really quickly for some of these communications, maybe after the webinar, we can pull together some of these resources for these mass communication services or anything else that you can think of.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're real handy too, because they are disruptive, which is good. Like you said, people don't always check email, but when your phone dings, for some reason, everybody picks it up.
Right. Okay, so step 5 is recovery, right? So how do you recover from the crisis? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there's rolling recovery. So for example, COVID-19, the recovery is when, I guess at some point, we say, okay, it's kind of restorative getting back to normal. But for the organization that's already made the decision to cancel the meeting, they're now in recovery from having canceled the meeting, right? So there's different phases of recovery. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, the recovery, in terms of a meeting that gets canceled, your recovery might be, did you cancel it? Are you postponing or rescheduling it? Is it something that you can do? I was working with one client and they canceled their annual, which I believe was coming up in May, and they were thinking of having it in November. But one of the discussions that came up on it was November's only a handful of months away from next May. So is having the meeting in November going to impact next May? It's not going to, and that's an issue worth looking at, because if people may go, well, I went in November, I'll just wait 18 months and do it again. Again, how that gets, we're working through that issue now, but it's part of it. And then you have to look at what the economics were of canceling / rescheduling the May event anyway. So yeah, there's going to be different levels of recovery. Organizationally, you're going to be looking at when do you go back to work. I mean, as soon as they lift the order there in Maryland, Virginia, and DC, do you suddenly run back to the office? Well, it might not be that easy. What about the people that have kids whose schools aren't going back until next September? So you've got those issues to look at as well. You just don't tell staff good luck. Some of the groups we're working with are taking a 2-week approach. They say, we will give you 2 weeks notice before you have to come back. So when those orders are lifted, they'll say, okay, 2 weeks from today, you need to start reporting back to the office. That gives you 2 weeks to, as they say, get your affairs in order. So recovery is challenging because it's not just turn off what you're doing in response and turn on what you're doing in recovery. You may have had different methods of doing business that have evolved during this work at home phase. You've got other services that may have come out of canceled meetings. What if your canceled meetings now have turned into a massive online series of webinars? I was actually supposed to do a conference about a month ago, and they canceled it. As you might gather, it was in Baltimore. But now they're taking all the speakers, and we're all doing our speech as a webinar, and they've created a library and a way of delivering those. Now, I'm sure it's not going to make near the money that the conference did, but on the other hand, they're able to deliver that. So do you just suddenly undo that and go, oh, we can have conferences again? Well, that may or may not work. You may have created a new normal to the way you do business. So rescheduling, moving to other platforms, other ways of doing business all have to be reevaluated to determine what your recovered normal is going to actually look like. Because I can almost guarantee you it won't look like what it did last December.
Right. And I think, Bob, let me just say this. I think recovery for some organizations is how do you recover from the emotional and the financial impact of a lot of this? I mean, sure. Clients that are saying, I'm canceling my meeting and that represents 30% of my revenue for the year. So you got to have a plan for recovering that. You either say, I got to cut expenses, or we're going to ask the board to move money out of reserves. And then we're going to load this year's budget. So all of those things, you have to have an intentional plan for it. And that's part of the recovery. I think the
part of
one
it.
thing is really figuring out, from the debrief, is to figure out, what worked, right? Like what do you got to do to make the plan work better, the next time, so that you're a little bit more nimble.
Sure.
And all that.
I think the biggest thing people forget is the debriefing. They really do. And to me, I hate to say it, but the most important part of the learning experience of this is what can you get out of what you just went through?
Yeah. So Bob, we're in a COVID-19 crisis right now. Like, where are we? Like, what phase?
So you basically got your awareness phase, which you're in because of the monitoring and the assessment, and you're in response. So if you're just now waking up to your crisis plan, you've missed a few. But you're in a response mode right now. Hurricane season, if you're in that part of the country, you should already be working in those previous phases, because you could be in the response in the not too distant future. And then with what you're learning now from COVID-19 could help you in the next flu season. And again, not knowing how bad a lot of you were impacted by the flu season earlier in the year, just the regular old flu season, having a little forethought. But right now, as far as COVID-19, we are in awareness and response at this point, and are likely to be in those two phases for a while.
Bob, we talk about COVID-19, and then people are probably looking at this and saying, flu season, not that, that's no big deal. But I'll tell you, several years ago, half the 5th grade class in my son's school was out with the flu.
Yeah.
And so you imagine if all of a sudden flu ravages your company, right? Like, what happens to your operation? So I think those are things to think about. So right now we say we're in awareness, right? So these are some of the things we got to think about. What do the next 6 weeks look like? Is this getting worse or better? And here's, I think, important. What stats are you going to use to determine if this is getting better or worse? And not just the stats about what's happening in your state, but other stats that maybe are much more relevant to your organization, right? So if you're in construction, what's happening to job sites? Are more of them closing or opening? If you're an organization that deals with food retail, for example, and we've got a bunch of clients, what's happening to the supply chain, and what's happening to the trend of people being able to go to the stores or not go to the stores that you can pay attention to, and not just, how many people are dying.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And, there is an impact to all that, and that has to be assessed. I mean, I know out here a lot of restaurants, pretty much all the restaurants out here in Arizona are closed for indoor seating. I'm sure you guys are, even in your area are way worse off than we are, but that's new to us. So now it's curbside, delivery, or drive-through, if you're thinking that. Same thing with groceries. Who wants to go in a grocery store? But all that's part of the, looking out, because businesses are going to have to make decisions. Is it better to just shut down? Now, I'm not saying that works in every case, but in some cases, it's better to just turn the lights out and wait than it is to try and work minimally in an area that may not be profitable for you for whatever length of time. So it's tough. The 6 weeks out thing that you had on the previous slide, I think, is a real good one. If you can implement that kind of a rolling 6-week assessment, drop a week and add a week each week, I think you'll find that you have a better handle on what's going on.
I also think that one thing that would be helpful to organizations is if you have these rolling assessments, include different people from different parts of the organization so that you get that perspective. Like, grab somebody from IT who's in the trenches, grab somebody who's from the administrative staff, grab someone and just say, what's the impact if this goes on for another 6 weeks? So I'll tell you, here's something really simple. So, the stay-at-home order here in Virginia, and I said to my staff, I said, what happens to the mail, right? What happens to the checks that our clients are sending us? So, we got to act. There's a bunch of things that we can do. They're not all terrific. So, but, and we got to figure out which of those, we got to enact. So, but right now we're also in response mode, right? How long do we work from home? When do we decide to cancel the meeting? And that's pretty important. And then lots of rolling reevaluation, I think, Bob, is what you're recommending.
That is exactly what I'm recommending. At some point, you'll start to see these governmental orders get pulled off, for stay at home, work at home, live, don't go anywhere, whatever the order is in the area. They'll start to unravel. And at that point, then you need to be evaluating going, when do you go back to work? When do you start that? What if you need to clean your facility? If anybody that, we've got a couple that have actually had COVID-19 positive people that had been working. So now they got to go back and clean the facility too. So depending on your organization and where you work, you may have to do that as well. So all that needs to be factored in. But, if you say we're not in for 6 weeks, you've got some time to work that response out, or work that, your procedures out for doing those things.
So before the next crisis, and I'm going to move us along here, I think, here are Bob's recommendations, right? Debrief from this crisis, use the same process, make your plan better, formalize your plan. But really, ultimately, it's figuring out what changes do you need to make to your governance now to facilitate the next response. Because I think you can do things like, well, I'll tell you, some things take time. If your IT person says, that didn't work out so well, we overwhelmed the VPN. Okay, great. So today, you probably want to put in place, because it's probably going to take you some time to really kind of increase your capacity and increase your VPN capacity. But there are other things, like the organization that needs the board to make a decision to allow voting online, for example. You got to, that board meeting doesn't happen for another 3 months, all of those things. So like before the next crisis, what do you need to do?
Right.
Okay, so what about this? So but specifically about meetings, right? So how do people make this decision, and how do they make this decision based on good data, Bob? Because it's so fraught these days, and so many organizations rely on meetings for revenue.
Yeah, I think, at this point, one of the first things you have to look at is whether or not you're even going to be able to have that meeting. So, considering the cities and the locales that are just flat out closed, you need to be aware of that. So that you may not have a choice. So let's set that aside. How are your registrations trending? Do your various insurance policies cover these types of reasons for canceling? So for example, it may be better if the city closes down or closes, say, the convention center, and you can have your meeting versus you deciding to close your meeting, shut your meeting down. So you need to look at that. The economic impacts are always going to come into play. They just do. And then what do you do about that? People moving in terms of coming into that particular area, doing that meeting. We talked about having a meeting online versus not. Not every meeting can be done online, but what if you can in some way do a virtual meeting to cover some things? And that may be the area for board meetings if your governance was right. Demographics of the attendees, that was interesting. That actually came out of a group we worked with that went and looked at the ages of their typical attendee, and found out that most of them, in their case, I think it was about 45 or 50%, were in that 55 plus age bracket. So their concern was, are they bringing people to the meeting that were in that sort of sweet spot for COVID-19? I don't think COVID-19 is being that discerning anymore, but at the time it was. So that was an issue. And then looking at other ways to hold it. But you need to get information from reliable sources. Get real data. Like I said, Facebook for real data is probably not the place to go. But on the other hand, is what your registrations are doing. What the trends are based on the cities and locales that you're going to. So I would look at all that type of data without getting caught up in it, but just to give you something to base your facts on, as well as knowing what the venues are saying, what your insurance companies are saying, and then match that against your economic impacts.
And I think I like this list, and obviously this list should be much longer for almost every organization. But instead of making oh my God, I got to cancel the meeting, because people are pressuring me to do it, if you have this information, it's readily accessible, you can assemble it pretty fast. even if the decision ultimately ends up being the same thing, at least you know, and you're not acting in the dark, and you're not acting, without planning. You can go to the board and say, okay, guys, this meeting is in July, but so many people have already canceled, right? It looks like even if we come out of this crisis and like all the states start opening up, it doesn't look like people are going to want to come anyway. So let's make the decision now. So that's related to like your trend, for example. So come up with those questions, and then for your upcoming meetings, make sure that you have this information handy. Brian, is there a question?
I have a few of those coming in. Do you want to say those to the end?
No, let's take them.
So I have actually a great one. Do you have any tips for responding to membership community who is wanting a decision now when you're working on a rolling assessment?
Okay. So Bob, the question is, the membership wants to know now. I think, this is me, right? I would put this information together and then say to the membership, hey, we've got a plan and we've got a set of criteria for deciding on the meeting, and then give them a time frame for when you're going to make the decision.
Absolutely.
And then at least that's a decision, right? You may not have a decision on the meeting, but then you've got a decision about when you're going to make the decision.
Absolutely. In crisis management, there's a lot that goes down to setting expectations, and that's exactly what you've done. There's nothing worse than letting people hang. And in this case, you're saying, we've got information, we have a timeline, we will make a decision, and now you know what our plan is going to be. And that's a much better way of doing it, to go and we'll get around to it, or we've already done it and we'll tell you all later.
Right. And I think for the organization that made the decision, if somebody says why you decide to cancel, you can say, well, based on this and this and this and this and this, and then who's going to question that, right? Your board's going to make a decision. Brian, other questions?
Okay, I got a fabulous one.
Okay.
What is the best way to get your board to make a decision now, to go virtual and not wait when you have a June meeting? So when do we deal with the board? When do we go virtual?
So what's the best way? I mean, I think, again, put this information together, right? What you want to do is, how far out are you from the meeting? What's the size of the meeting? What's the revenue of the meeting? What's the registration trend? If you don't hold the meeting, what's the impact? If you hold the meeting and you have to cancel at the last minute because this crisis extends, what's the impact, right? And then say, if we decide to do virtual, do we have a plan? Do we not have a plan? If we go virtual, what's the impact on revenue? What's the impact on engagement? What's the demographics of our attendees? If you say, for example, Bob, I think demographics come into play here too. If your demographics for a particular meeting, right? Maybe you have a leadership meeting and it's all 60 somethings. You might say, is this a group that's really going to enjoy doing it in an online setting? If the answer is no, you might think about it, versus I know my 9-year-old, I said to him a couple weeks ago, I said, hey, you want to do a Zoom lunch bunch? And he said, sure. I literally turned it on and all of a sudden they're playing Pictionary. And I said, what are you doing? He's like, oh, we discovered the whiteboard, and they're doing stuff. So I think, again, if you go to your board and say, we don't know, it doesn't feel right. But if you've got some of this information, you can say to them, hey, based on this, here's what we're recommending, or based on this, you guys make the decision. I don't know if that helps. Brian?
Yeah, but also be aware, in this particular situation, be aware too that the more time goes by based on what we're dealing with, the more likely we are to be using this technology in a broader and broader basis. So that board meeting or committee meeting that might have fallen apart in December on Zoom, by August could be a major hit, just because people are starting to live this way now, and the technology is becoming more accessible and understandable to a larger group of people.
That's a good point too. If the person who asked the question said, look, I really just want to make the decision now to go virtual, again, walk your board through it, right? And then say, if we decide to go virtual, here's the impact on everything. And by the way, by making the decision now, we have time to really plan it, and we have actually time to do a dry run. Brian, any more questions?
We have several. Is everyone okay staying for a few extra minutes?
You know what, it's 3:00, but let's take a few more questions. And if you got to drop, I am going to, we're going to send this out. So again, here's contact information, both phone and email for both me and Bob. Give us a call, let us know how we can help you. So, but Brian, let's take a few more questions.
Yeah, I've got What is the greatest lesson each of you have learned from the present COVID-19 pandemic? If you had one piece of advice for associations, what would that be?
Bob, you start.
Yeah, first thing is to know that Joanna was going to throw that one my way first. But I think the biggest thing is that planning ahead of time is really the right route to take. And I think what has happened is the lesson I've learned is people, just basically groups, were not prepared. And preparedness comes from planning. It also comes from an understanding of the plan you put in place. So if you have a plan and one person knows it, the lesson we'd learn from that is, can you make sure that more people understand the plan going forward? So at this point, I think a lot of people were taken off guard by this, and that has to do with the plan and one's awareness or understanding of the plan.
I'll tell you what I've learned from this, and this may not be popular, but if you think about it, like a CEO of this organization, I got a lot of people that I basically answer to and I got to take care of. I got my employees, I got my clients, I got the customers of my clients. But the lesson that I've really learned is that I have got to take care of my employees first. Because if I take care of them, they are much more able to take care of the clients. And so there have been times, like last weekend, for example, because people were so busy, where my VP of Ops said, I got to give people a break. Like, I know clients are really busy right now, but I got to give them a break. So we said, we got to take care of the people first, so that, because otherwise they're going to get run down, they're going to get burned out, they might get sick. So protect the people who are, serving others. Brian, another question.
I think this is more about accessibility and virtual meetings. How do you manage virtual meetings with members or staff with hearing impairments or other restrictions that might prohibit virtual meetings from being diverse?
God, I don't know that I have a quick answer to that one.
Yeah, I don't think I do either.
But you know what I would say is, go ahead, Bob, and then I have something quick.
No, I was just thinking the thing to do in that case is it still comes down to how do you make sure that if you go virtual, you can deal with the people that are supposed to be attending that meeting. And if you have individuals that have other situations, will the technology for that virtual meeting allow them to participate? If not, maybe one needs to look at technology that will.
I have two thoughts on that. One is there is technology that lets you do real-time transcription. It's not perfect, but it does exist, which we can send resources about that. The other thing is, like, if you think about this Zoom meeting, right? So like I'm talking live and there's lots of you. What you could do is have, in the same way that you have this at meetings, you can have someone maybe signing live, right? So that then the person who is maybe, hearing impaired is actually able to follow along with the presentation via the person doing sign language. So that's just a thought. Another question, Brian.
I've got one more so far.
Yep.
And again, it's getting back to the decision-making process regarding meetings. Should I hold off on opening registration if my meeting is in August, instead of refunding and giving a new opening date later?
Should I hold off on opening registration? Bob, what do you say?
Wow. I personally would be inclined not to hold it off unless the area you're going to have your meeting in happens to be like, a city that's getting just bombarded. If you're in New York, Chicago, you might have to hold it off because what's the point? But if you're running in a place that maybe is a little lesser, you might want to consider it. It'll give you some data. If you have to cancel the meeting, you have to refund whatever you took in anyway. So one of the things to do might be to ask a few people what they think, because the potential attendees are going to have a much better feel for what their take is versus, say, looking at it generically. So I don't know. I think opening it up right now is a challenge. I honestly can't say if I'd do it or not right now without scribbling some numbers down and doing a little better impact analysis.
I think I have a different opinion. I would say wait, and I'll tell you why. I don't think anyone's making any decisions about any travel, so you're not going to get registrations anyway. I actually would probably wait. This is just me, just based on like the tracking that we've been doing, the decision making that we've been doing, and the conversations from clients, since few people are going to be making any travel, I don't think, unless you need the reg money really pretty desperately, I think we got to wait until the end of April to see what the vector is on this. Is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Because if it's going to get worse, no one's registering. But if it starts to get better, then I think what happens is you've got a really positive message to go out with at the end of April or in May to say, hey, it looks like we're starting to come out on, on the other side of this, and our meeting's not till August. And what a fantastic way to come together as a community. So plan now. So that's kind of how I'm feeling right now.
Let me also just, I like the way, I like what you said. And I think the one thing to do is if registration was supposed to open now, is be open with your potential attendees to say, we're not going to open it and here's why. Yes, and we'll let you know when we do. In other words, set some expectations as opposed to just, coming soon, to a screen near you. Because I don't think that's going to work.
Yes, say we were supposed to open it, but we're going to monitor. And then I think it also sends a message of caring, instead of like acting like this pandemic isn't happening and acting like it's business as usual. It's sort of not business as usual. And say it's business as usual in the sense of we're working, we're serving you, we're doing all this other stuff, but knowing that there might be a lot of constraints. The fact also is like you might have companies that through the end of the year say no travel just to be on the safe side. So like what's your meeting anyway? So if your meeting's not till August, put this plan in place and then say, hey, what do our contracts say? Can we reduce our minimum on the hotels and make sure that you're keeping track of those dates, right? You never want those dates to just slide by and all of a sudden you can't cancel. You might already be too late for an August meeting, but hopefully not. Any more questions, Brian?
Why don't we give another 60 seconds? I saw a hand go up at some point, but either through the chat or the Q&A box, feel free to, ask a question. We'll hang on for another minute.
Okay, all right. So, I think there's no question that this is a time of high emotion. And I'll tell you, I'm in a CEO group, and this group is actually meeting every week just to provide support to each other, but also to share what we're learning. And I'm going to share with you something that my coach said. He said, Joanna, all my years of coaching, what I've learned, and I've even blogged about this, is that CEOs bring the weather. And what did he mean by that? He said, well, you bring light and clarity, or you put a damper on things. Right. So whatever is happening, I don't think in all of this, you got to be genuine. Right. But you're also kind of the pillar, the person that people are looking to during this tough time. So remember that as leaders, we bring the weather. OK, and I know that for myself, my ability to be effective and to make good decisions is really based on having good data, as Bob says. It all goes back to the plan. If you go back to the plan and you say, well, this according to our plan was when we're going to trigger this response, unless we're going to rethink that whole plan, we're going to make this decision and this is how it's going to go. Brian, any more questions? No questions. All right. Well, listen.
There's some good conversation, some good statements coming in. This has been great.
Well, for those of you who stuck with us, thank you for giving us a few extra minutes. I want to say thank you to Bob. Bob, you're just the superstar here. I mean, thank you for distilling all your years of knowledge, and thanks for making yourself available to the folks who are clearly, we're all struggling. I'll be honest with you. I got good days and I got bad days. So thank you, and good luck to everyone. We hope that we were able to give you a little bit of guidance during this tough time. Bob, thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.
All right, bye.